Good evening. And welcome all of you to our Wednesday night Modern Mind series here at Beth, which is sponsored by Heidi and Albert Croix. We really have the great privilege this evening of hosting one of the chief Middle Eastern policy experts over the last 2 decades, Ambassador Dennis Ross. And Ambassador Ross, it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Ambassador Ross is a highly skilled diplomat with over 2 decades of experience in Soviet and Middle Eastern policy. He has served as a senior advisor, Middle East envoy to President George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama. And just the fact that you can have a senior advisor to presidents who span the spectrum of politics, I think shows that people can know an expert and they recognize an expert when they see one. He has tremendous experience, very knowledgeable, many achievements over the course of his career, and he's devoted his professional life, really, or a significant part of it, to bringing about peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And so, Ambassador Ross, I really have to hand it to you, because that is not an easy task at all, and I'm sure it's been frustrating, but it's very, very important. And in that context, he's also an expert on Israel-United States diplomatic relationships, perhaps an expert more than anyone else. So it's really a great opportunity to hear from a leading expert on an issue that's so important to us, the United States-Israel relationship and also the Arab-Israel peace process. It's an issue for which dozens and dozens of members of our community are going to be traveling across the country to the APAC Policy Conference to advocate for and to learn about and to support that alliance. And so it's really a great honor, without further ado, to introduce you. Please give a warm welcome to Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to kind of walk and talk. I also teach, and I find that when I walk and talk, more things occur to me than might if I was just standing still behind the podium. Something else I want to do tonight, I'm going to engage you tonight. I'm going to talk about, I have a book that's out called Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli Relationship from Truman to Obama. I'm going to talk about that, but I'm going to engage you in the process. I'm going to start by talking about current situations. I should note that I'm frequently in touch with people in the region, Arabs and Israelis alike, and they're asking me these days to explain our politics. And I think it's easier to explain the Middle East than it is to explain our politics. So if you can explain our politics, you'll explain that to me. But I'm going to focus more on what's going on in the Middle East and the U.S.-Israeli relationship and give you a sense of how it has evolved, why it has evolved, why I'm basically optimistic about it. You don't entitle the book Doomed to Succeed unless you're basically optimistic, although when you say doomed to succeed, it implies there's a sense of irony there, and I'll get to and explain that. But let me start off with a question for you. I said I'm going to engage you, and I mean it. What do you think the most important priority in the Middle East as a whole is to the Obama administration in its last year? What do you think? Iran? Well, I mean, they've already done their deal with Iran. There was elections that just took place in the parliament. It is interesting that all the stories about that election were that all the reformers who were running were disqualified as candidates, and then when the election took place, what we heard is that the moderates won, which is an interesting kind of contradiction. I think what it reflects is that not so much that there were that many moderates who were allowed to run, but that basically the Iranians who vote, and the public tends to vote, particularly in the urban areas, they tend to vote these days for who they know is not an opponent of Rouhani. Rouhani, having done this deal, has created a sense among Iranians that something can change for the better. So all those who opposed the nuclear deal in Iran and who were identified as being conservatives or what are known as principalists, they tended to lose in these elections. But the people who ran against them weren't necessarily reformers. There is a list, by the way, that was called the List of Hope. Sounds good, right? List of Hope. Except some of the people on it were actually some of the people who were the strongest critics of those who were out in the streets in 2009 protesting the election. So it's not clear to me that a lot of the people who were portrayed as moderates necessarily are, but they're not opponents of Rouhani. And Rouhani seems to have done well in this election. I don't think Iran is a major preoccupation or is a major priority for the Obama administration in the last year. What do you think it is?
ISIS.
No? ISIS. Who said ISIS? Okay, ISIS. ISIS is the main priority. And to succeed against ISIS, we need Sunni partners, the Sunni Arabs. Now, the reason we need Sunni partners is because ISIS is Sunni, and if you're going to discredit ISIS, you need Sunnis to discredit ISIS. The Iranians can't discredit ISIS because they're Shia. And if you're going to set ISIS back, if you're going to begin to defeat it, you need Sunnis not only to fight it, but you also need Sunnis to replace it. If there are no Sunnis to take the place when you set ISIS back or when you defeat them, for example, when Ramadi was liberated of ISIS, the prospect of ensuring that the next incarnation, or reincarnation, the next version of ISIS, if we don't want that to reappear in Ramadi or wherever it is removed or set back, then Sunnis have to replace it and there has to be a kind of decent governance. Now, if Sunnis are not replacing it, if Sunnis aren't partnered with us, we're going to have a very hard time defeating ISIS. That's fundamentally the problem. Sunnis have to fight it, Sunnis have to discredit it, and then Sunnis have to replace it. Otherwise, you're going to get the next version of it. ISIS is itself, it grew out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was basically defeated in 2007 and 2008, but then ISIS reemerged because of a very sectarian government led by then Maliki in Iraq and what Assad did in Syria. So you need Sunnis as partners. Now, do we have Sunnis as partners right now, actively fighting, joining with us?
Yes.
Not really. Actually, it was a rhetorical question. You're right. We don't. There's a reason we don't. Because their priority, most of the Gulf states, their priority is not ISIS. Their priority is Iran. They see Iran as the main threat. They don't see ISIS as the main threat. They won't be joining in the fight against ISIS unless, in fact, we look like we're more capable, more determined of protecting Sunnis. In Syria, you have now a pause, a cessation of hostilities, not a ceasefire. That pause is better than what existed a week ago. That pause is something that reflects an agreement that embodies a set of principles that were first agreed in November, but the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians and Hezbollah and all the Shia militias didn't respect any of those principles. And then it was supposed to be, then you had a Security Council resolution in December embodying them again. The steps that could have been taken to create a real ceasefire weren't taken. And then finally there was an agreement on February 12th that again said, okay, in a week we'll have a cessation of hostilities. Finally, this last Saturday, we began to see what was a pause. My expectation is that the Russians will treat this the way they have treated the Minsk agreement in Ukraine, which is to say, they will, when it suits their interest to respect it, they will. And when they decide they can take advantage of it, they will. And in the meantime, the message to the Sunnis is that basically Sunnis are not being protected in Syria, they have been under assault. Why? Because the Russians were bombing all the 9 ISIS Sunni groups, and we have been bombing ISIS, which is also Sunni. If this pause is something that becomes transformed into a genuine ceasefire, then there will be an image that we are in fact beginning to do something that offers actual protection to Sunnis, and then we're more likely to have them join us. But until that's the case, we're unlikely to have it. And unfortunately, today, I think it's fair to say that most of the Arab states don't have a high degree of trust in the Obama administration. You think that's an understatement? I'm a diplomat. What do you expect? All right, so the point here is that the priorities of the administration are not the priorities of most of the Arab leaders. And that's not something that's new. When I describe what the reality has been since Truman's time up until today, what you'll see is that rarely have we understood the priorities of Arab leaders. So I want to get into that, but I want to get into it by starting with an observation now also about what happened in response at the beginning of the, if you go back 5 months, Israel has for the last 5 months has been experiencing almost daily acts of terror. For the first 2 weeks of the stabbings, and these stabbings are being carried out by those who are almost exclusively between the ages of 15 and 25. 80% of those committing the stabbings are under the age of 20. They're not organized. They're not part of a structure. They have no leadership. They are frequently driven either by a sense of revenge or anger or what they see in social media. There's a variety of factors that are contributing to this, but it's not a structure and organization. As I say, the good news is it's not organized, and the bad news is it's not organized. And I don't know when it's going to end. We can get into that maybe in the Q&A when I'll talk more about that. But my reason for raising it is that for the first couple of weeks, when the stabbings began, the administration's response was to call for an end to the cycle of violence. Okay? There wasn't a cycle of violence, there were just stabbings, which were acts of terror. As I often say, when you talk about stabbings, you're talking about maybe the most intimate form of terror that you can have. It's not an abstraction. Those who carry out the stabbings are seeing who they're stabbing. It literally is a form of bloodletting. There is nothing more clearly an act of terror than stabbings. And yet, for the first couple of weeks, the administration's response was to refer to it as a cycle of violence and urge calm on both sides. And the reason for it was because the administration didn't want to be seen as criticizing only the Palestinians, because there was a fear that if they were criticizing only the Palestinians, it would create a backlash. A backlash from the Palestinians, a backlash from the Arabs. But that mindset is not unique to this administration. That mindset that you can't really criticize only the Arabs is a mindset that has existed in every administration from Truman until today. Well, I'm going to explain it. I mean, you can talk or I can talk, but if I explain it, you'll have a chance to understand why. So, the mindset, as I said, is embodied in every administration from Truman to Obama. In fact, what it represented was a constituency in the national security apparatus. When I say the national security apparatus, what I mean is the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence communities. In every part of that apparatus, you had a constituency, a significant group that basically looked at Israel through a lens. And the lens was one that had them see Israel as a problem and not a partner. Okay, in every administration, that mindset has been there, that group has been there. There's only one administration where that group didn't have any influence. It existed, but it had no influence. You think it was George W. Bush? How many people here think it was George W. Bush was the one administration where that group didn't have any influence? So, several of you are prepared to commit and say that. Most of you are simply uncertain, or you're not sure, or you're afraid that I might call on you. All right, the guess that it was George W. Bush is a really excellent guess. It's wrong, but it's an excellent guess. And if President Obama were sitting here, he would have made the same guess. I'll tell you in a second who it was. It was not Lyndon Johnson. It was not Reagan.
Truman.
I'll tell you in a second who it was. But first, I want to explain. It's clearly a Jewish audience. First, I want to explain why George W. Bush was a very good guess, but it was wrong. I want to explain, if President Obama were here, why he would have made the same guess. In July of 2009, he met with a senior group of Jewish leaders. And one of them said to him, if you want Israel to move on peace, you need to be right next to it. And President Obama said, for 8 years, there was no daylight between the United States and Israel Israel did nothing, and we paid a price with the Arabs. Okay, now, so he said, first, there was no daylight. Secondly, he said, Israel did nothing, and thirdly, it cost us with the Arabs. It turns out that almost each of these statements is wrong. So let's start with the most important point. The fact is that we know that during the 8 years, we had Israeli prime ministers who actually took big steps, precisely because they felt that George W. Bush was close to them. Ariel Sharon withdrew 100% from Gaza, settlements, and the IDF. And he did that because of the relationship with George W. Bush. Ehud Olmert made an effort to cut through all the differences, sat down with Abu Mazen, and made a proposal which went beyond the Clinton parameters in terms of trying to resolve all the core issues. I know something about the Clinton parameters because I wrote them. And Olmert went beyond the Clinton parameters in terms of what he offered. So the mere fact that there was a sense of confidence in the relationship with George W. Bush actually produced very big moves by the Israelis. It didn't produce a response, but it produced big moves by the Israelis. But at the beginning of the Bush administration, that's not where George W. Bush was coming from. In the aftermath of 9/11, in the aftermath of George W. Bush declaring a war on terror, his first call to Ariel Sharon, which was about a week after 9/11, after he declared a war on terror, he was pressing Ariel Sharon to have his foreign minister, then Shimon Peres, meet Yasser Arafat. Now this is in the midst of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada, starting in 2001, began to be characterized by bombings. And Yasser Arafat bore responsibility for that. George W. Bush would not have dreamed of us talking to those responsible for 9/11, but he was pressing Ariel Sharon to deal with Yasser Arafat, and the reason was because there was a sense, this group I was describing before believed that 9/11 took place because of Israel, because we hadn't solved the Palestinian problem, and that we wouldn't have any partners in the war on terror unless we could solve the Palestinian problem. That was the mindset, and that was strong enough that it led George W. Bush to press Sharon. Some of you may remember later on October 4th, Sharon actually gives a speech where he says Israel will not be Czechoslovakia. Right? And that's because actually he responds to Bush. Initially he resists Bush, but then he responds to Bush. And he has Peres see Arafat. And then he himself, Sharon, for the first time comes out in favor of 2 states. And attacks continue. And it's only after that that he finally says enough. And that's when he gives a speech on October 4th. Now Bush himself, to be fair to Bush, he evolves. And he begins to ask himself the question, well, gee, I can't have one set of rules for war on terror for us and a different one for the Israelis. In fact, he writes about that in his own memoir. So he evolves, he changes, and he becomes actually a very good friend of Israel. In fact, he gives a speech to the Knesset in May of 2008, where he says, you may think you're only 7 million people, at that time 7 million. He said, but you're really 307 million, because you have us with you. That's not how Bush came in. And that constituency that I said has existed in every administration had sufficient influence that they affected how he spoke to Sharon after 9/11. And they emerge again at different points in the administration. During the war with Hezbollah in 2006, they emerge again. Their impact is limited by Bush over time. But the point is, this constituency that I said, they had influence during the Bush administration. All right, so I didn't answer the question. I told you it wasn't LBJ, it wasn't Reagan. I didn't tell you who it was. How many people want to know who it was? Okay, it was Bill Clinton. You didn't say it loud enough. I heard your other comments, but I didn't hear that one. See, this is really an interactive. Sometimes you can do interactive on your computer. This is interactive as well. Okay, so it was Bill Clinton. Why was it Bill Clinton? Bill Clinton believed that we were Israel's only friend in the world. And as Israel's only friend in the world, if we had differences with Israel, that was natural, but they should be kept private. They should be managed in private. If you expose the differences in public, if you created an image that there was a wedge between the United States and Israel, it would give encouragement to Israel's enemies. And that would weaken Israel's deterrence, and it would weaken peace. So, it was Bill Clinton. Okay, so, you ready for another question? You are. I didn't hear you back. Are you ready for another question? Okay, that's good. Okay, so, all right, another question. All right, so which administration was the toughest on Israel? From Truman to Obama? Right, Obama? No. Nixon. Interesting guess. Interesting guess. Not right. Right, Eisenhower's right. Okay, that's good. You imagine how you'll be able, once you've read the book, imagine how you'll be able to answer all these questions. Right, so it was Eisenhower. Eisenhower came in, and Eisenhower believed that Truman had made his decisions as it related to Israel based exclusively on political reasons and that he owed things to the Jews. Literally, this is what Eisenhower thought. And the reason he thought it was because, how many of you ever read the book called The Wise Men? Have you heard of a book called The Wise Men? Well, a book was written about the key people who shaped the major institutions of the Cold War. And they were people like George C. Marshall, and there were George Kennan, there were Forrestal, Robert Lovett. Anyway, all of the advisors, every single one of the major advisors in the Truman administration, all the so-called wise men were uniformly against recognizing the state of Israel. Every single one. And Truman decided over their objections to recognize. And Eisenhower felt the only explanation, since it couldn't be substance because these were the experts, the only explanation could be politics. In fact, it wasn't politics at all. It was the fact that the Jews had actually created a state. And not to recognize them was to penalize them. And they had created a state even though all of these same experts said they couldn't do it. It was actually, the CIA issued an intelligence assessment the day before the vote in the UN on the partition plan. The vote on the partition plan was November 29th, 1947, November 28th, 1947. Just coincidentally, the CIA came out with an intelligence assessment which said there was no way a Jewish state could be viable. The only way it could be viable was if we, the U.S., provided 500,000 troops. Now, they didn't issue this assessment because they wanted the partition plan to be supported. You know, whenever, having been in a lot of administrations, you know, if you ever want to kill an idea, just say 500,000 American troops are required. That's the surest way to kill it. And all the so-called experts at the time said, no way is a Jewish state viable. No way can they fight on their own. They will need us. Now, they got nothing from us. Because even after we voted for petition, and even before Truman recognized the state, we imposed an arms embargo on arms to the Arab, which penalized only the Yeshiv, the Jewish community in Palestine, and then the state of Israel. Because the British were providing arms to Egypt, they were providing arms to Transjordan. In fact, the Arab Legion, which was the Jordanian, basically the Jordanian military, was financed, armed, and led by seconded British officers. So arms were getting into Palestine, and oftentimes when the British were getting out, between the partition plan and May 15th, 1948, they would turn over the police stations to the Arabs. So arms were going to the other side. When we imposed an embargo, it penalized only one side. Notwithstanding that, they had a state. They built the institutions in advance, but basically they fought effectively. And then they fought effectively after they declared the state and were invaded by all their neighbors. And we still provided no arms. Yet, Eisenhower's view was Truman had tilted way too much towards the Jews, towards Israel, and it cost us in the Middle East. And he was determined when he came in to change that. So one of the things that they did very quickly, Israel tried very early on in March of 1953 to use water from the Jordan River to create hydroelectric power. When the Arabs complained that the Israelis were doing that, the Eisenhower administration suspended the loans that had been offered by the Truman administration as a way of immediately penalizing the Israelis. Eisenhower would give a press conference in 1954 when he was asked about, would he provide arms to Israel, and he said, "Why would I provide arms to someone who might engage in aggression?" Dulles, when he made his first trip to the Middle East in the spring of 1953, and the whole focus of his trip was to say, we're going to now have relations that reflect our interests, which means we're going to build our relations with the Arabs. And he said to the Lebanese in his first stop that we're unlike Truman, who was dependent on the Jews, the Republicans, unlike the Democrats, don't need the Jews. Later on, he would say, at one point he would say, Marshall tried to have a foreign policy not run by the Jews, we're going to have a foreign policy not run by the Jews. I mean, these were the attitudes of Eisenhower and Dulles during the 1956 war, which was a war in which the Israelis basically worked with the French and the British. It was basically a plan devised by the French. When the Israelis go in, Eisenhower actually contemplates the use of American force to expel the Israelis. He doesn't do it, but he threatens sanctions on Israel. And never during the course of his administration do we provide arms to the Israelis. I mean, it's interesting, we not only don't provide arms, we tell them when they make requests for arms, we tell them, you should seek the goodwill of your neighbors. Now, every one of their neighbors rejected their existence, and every one of their neighbors were providing platforms for the Fedayeen, self-sacrificers, to carry out attacks against Israel. This was an administration that was fundamentally hostile towards Israel. This was an administration that basically believed that our interests were with the Arabs, and Israel was basically a complication, a problem. So, yes, this is the toughest administration on the Israelis. But it's fair to say that they never suspended arms to Israel because, of course, they never provided arms to Israel. So which administration suspended arms to Israel as a punishment? Nixon suspends arms, but not as a punishment. No, not. I'll tell you later what Nixon did. He did not suspend arms as a punishment. There's only one president who suspends arms to Israel as a punishment.
Reagan.
No. Who said Reagan? It's Reagan. Look at all you're learning. Imagine how much, when you read this book, imagine how much you're going to know. Really, it's astounding. It was Reagan. Reagan suspended F-16s after the Israelis bombed the Osiris reactor in Iraq. When he resumed the shipments in the fall, this is May 1981. When he resumes the shipments in the fall of 1981, he suspends them again in December, when Menachem Begin extends Israel's long administration to the Golan Heights. And so he suspends arms twice. That, by the way, is not the low point of the Reagan administration with Israel. The low point comes during the siege of Beirut, over an 8-week period in the summer of 1982, and then in the aftermath of that, with what happens to Saba and Shatila. Those are really the low points of the Reagan administration, where Reagan actually, on a number of occasions, by my count, 5 times, Reagan threatens the future of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Reagan also, during the fight over AWACS, to sell AWACS to Saudi Arabia, he gives a press conference on October 1, 1981, and he says that it is not the business of any foreign country to make the foreign policy of the United States. Now, this is a press conference in which his answer is directly in response to his reaction to what Israel and its friends in this country are doing on the Hill against AWACS. That was probably the toughest statement any American president has made towards Israel. And in fact, it is the toughest statement in terms of implying a dual loyalty issue that any American president has made. And yet, Reagan is not remembered that way, right? Reagan is remembered as a very good friend of Israel, correct? And you know what? It's right, it's fair, because Reagan changes. In 1984, January 1984, Reagan creates something called the Joint Political Military Group, and this becomes the umbrella and the foundation and ultimately the architecture to create strategic cooperation with Israel. Until this point, we've never had strategic cooperation with Israel. Until this point, Israel is never really treated as a partner. There might be individuals who see it that way. And he acquires a sense of moral obligation to the state of Israel. Now, it's not enough in the first 2 years to overcome what are a series of what he sees as Israeli surprises. And he has people in his administration who are truly hostile. During the siege of Beirut, you have Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, who actually calls for breaking relations with Israel, as if they're North Korea. And Reagan obviously limits those things, but then he goes back to his instincts in January of '84. And he transforms the relationship, and what he builds in terms of that institutional structure, that institutional architecture, every president since that time, even if they didn't have the emotional connection to Israel, every president since that time has inherited this and built on it. Every single administration has added to what they inherited, including, by the way, the Obama administration. So the scope of what we do on security issues with the Israelis is more than existed in any previous administration. It's been institutionalized in a way that has, in a sense, taken on a life of its own. It doesn't mean it can't be affected by presidents, but it's had, in a sense, a life of its own. And it dates from then, and every president has built on it. There's one other very big change in the Reagan administration. I said there's been a constituency from Truman to Obama that sees Israel as a problem and not a partner. Starting in Reagan for the first time, you didn't have individuals who might see Israel differently. You began actually to have a constituency, a countervailing constituency. And the struggle, the battle between those two constituencies within the national security apparatus has basically been a hallmark of policymaking since that time. So, throughout this period, and you have this struggle, and then different presidents will decide on each issue between these two different constituencies. The one thing that has been common to the constituency that saw Israel as a problem were 3 assumptions. And those assumptions are just as alive today as they were in Truman's time, and as they have been in every other administration. And there are 3 basic assumptions. The first assumption, and they're interrelated. The first assumption is that if you distance from Israel, you will gain with the Arabs. 5 administrations have done that. 5. Eisenhower did it. Nixon did it. Carter did it. The first Bush did it. And Obama did it. What you'll see when you read the book, as I know you all will, what you'll see when you read the book is, in every chapter I go through how these assumptions played out as they relate to particular episodes. And there's no lessons that are learned. The same mistakes are repeated over and over again. This sense that we'll gain from the Arabs, I show repeatedly the assumption if we distance we'll gain. In no case do we ever gain. The most egregious example was Nixon. You raised Nixon. Nixon actually suspends arms to Israel not as a punishment. He suspends arms to Israel because he's trying to reach out to Nasser. He does it in March of 1970 when he suspends Phantoms, the F-4 Phantoms. And he does it because he hopes that Nasser will respond. What makes it egregious is not that he hopes Nasser will respond. What makes it egregious is he does it at the very moment that the Soviets, for the first time in their history, are sending not arms, but their military personnel to Egypt. So the very moment they're sending military personnel to Egypt and crossing a threshold, because they've never done this outside the Soviet bloc before, Nixon chooses that moment to suspend arms to Israel. And he sends his Undersecretary of State, Joe Sisko, to Egypt, and he goes there and says, look what we've done. Look at the gesture. We suspended F-4s to Israel, so you should respond. And what do you think Nasser's response was? He did the equivalent of up yours. What he did was he demanded more from us. So rather than it becoming something that attracted him, it made him think he could demand more from us, which has typically been the case when we've acted this way. Look, Obama in his first 6 months also distanced dramatically, right? The way he approached settlements, the fact that he goes to Cairo to give a speech, goes to Saudi Arabia but doesn't go to Israel. In the Cairo speech, he very much addresses the Arab and the Palestinian narrative, but not the Israeli narrative. All of this was calculated, all this was conscious, because there was a belief. He came in and he was going to be, he was ABB, anything but Bush. He had this image that Bush was so close to Israel, so one of the ways of being anything but Bush was to show we're not close to Israel and this was going to produce something from the Arabs, but it didn't. Just like what Nixon did, didn't. And in the countless other examples I give throughout the book. Right? So that was the assumption number one, which you distance from Israel and you gain with the Arabs. The problem is, it never works. The second assumption, which is a corollary of the first one, if you cooperate with Israel, you'll lose with the Arabs. Now, I can give lots of examples of this. I'm going to give one that I find interesting, and then I'm going to give it out of chronological order, because there's a one from Kennedy that I want to go back to because it connects very well to today. But the one out of chronological order is Johnson. Johnson is actually, Kennedy is the first one to provide arms to Israel. We don't provide any arms to Israel until Kennedy. But Kennedy provides a defensive weapon system called the Hawk anti-aircraft missile. It's not mobile, it's fixed, it can only be used if you're being attacked by airplanes. Johnson's the first one to provide aircraft and tanks. And he does it, by the way, because he feels King Hussein has come to him and said, look, if you don't provide arms to me, I'm going to have to take them from the Soviets. So he feels he needs to provide arms to King Hussein, but he doesn't think he can provide arms to King Hussein unless he provides arms to the Israelis, and in doing so, asks the Israelis to help with the Congress so he can get the arms to King Hussein. Now, truth be told, Johnson has maybe the strongest emotional attachment to Israel of anyone. There's little-known stories about Johnson. Johnson did a lot when he was a congressman to help rescue Jews. There's actually an extraordinary story about Johnson in terms of his sort of connections here. And so he feels a strong connection to the Israelis, and he does provide, for the first time, offensive weapons. I cite Johnson this if you cooperate with Israel, you lose with the Arabs, because in 1963, we were providing $44.5 million worth of arms to the whole Middle East. In 1968, we were providing $995 million, almost $1 billion, and almost all of that is going to the Arabs. Now, the reason I'm giving the example is the 1967 war. There was a kind of uniform consensus in the administration below Johnson that the war cost us with the Arabs. Richard Nixon, by the way, when he comes in, he writes in his memoirs that 1967 was a defeat for the United States. I'm pausing because that's, think about it. 1967 was a lot of things. It sure as hell wasn't a defeat for the United States. It was a defeat for the Soviets. They lost a lot of weapons. Their clients, lost territory. Their clients were set back. But Nixon viewed it as a defeat for the United States because he thought it was going to help the Soviets gain greater entree in the Middle East. That sentiment was a sentiment that existed heavily in the bureaucracy. And they felt, even someone like Eugene Rostow, who was a very strong supporter of Israel, and who in the Reagan administration actually is one who counters the legal arguments of Carter to say settlements were a problem, but they weren't illegal. But even he thinks that we need to improve our position with the Arabs after the Six-Day War. Now, the reason I cited the figures I just did before, $44.5 million worth of arms to the Arabs in 1963, $995 million worth of arms in 1968. Now, does that sound like we had a problem with the Arabs? Was there any Arab country that was getting arms from us who said, oh, you were with the Israelis in 67, therefore we don't want your arms? That's a rhetorical question. No one was saying, don't provide us your arms. And why? It wasn't just the value of the arms. The arms symbolized an American commitment to their security. All right? So this idea that somehow we were losing something in the Arabs, none of the Arab states that had a relationship with us walked away from that relationship, even though the image was different within the administration. All right, I want to go back to the Kennedy making the decision to provide arms for the first time. When Kennedy makes the decision to provide arms for the first time, I said it's Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. It causes an enormous controversy within the administration. Before he makes the final decision, there's a big debate. Every single one of our Arab ambassadors weighs in with cables from the region, and some of them are insulted. One in particular says, I get the whiff that this must be an election year. Why else would we be thinking about providing arms to Israel of all countries? This is an American ambassador. Now, the focal point of the opposition in the administration is Dean Russ, the Secretary of State. And Dean Russ says this will set a terrible precedent and it will cause grave damage to our relations with the Arabs. Okay? He says it will cause grave damage to our relations with the Arabs. Now, as luck would have it, he was seeing Crown Prince Faisal, who was the real leader of Saudi Arabia, the same day that news of these arms leaked out. They both happened to be in New York. It was the opening of the UN General Assembly. And so Russ has to go in there, having predicted this was going to cause grave damage to our relations with the Arabs. So when he walks in there, does he hear from Faisal, that's it? It's the end of the U.S.-Saudi relationship? Is that what he hears? It's a rhetorical question. Not only does he not hear that, Faisal doesn't raise the issue. Faisal raises instead the coup in Yemen. And he said, it's backed by Nasser, he says, Nasser's trying to achieve a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula to threaten us. And not only does he not raise the Israeli arms, not only does he complain only about the coup, but he wants new American commitments and he wants American arms. So where was the grave damage? Now, a week later, Faisal comes down to see President Kennedy in the Oval Office. So maybe in that intervening week, he came to his senses, right? He realized what Rusk and all the others were saying, how bad this would be. And therefore he came in to say to Kennedy, that's it. You can't be providing arms to the Israelis and have a relationship with us. Is that what he says? No, that's not what he says. He comes in and he complains about our outreach to Egypt. At this time, we were providing 2/3 of the Egyptian bread supply. Kennedy starts a process of providing what are known as PL-480 funds, which pays for American wheat. And we're providing 2/3 of the Egyptian bread supply. Faisal comes in and he says, what you're doing by providing this assistance to Nasser is freeing up his resources to threaten all of us. He's threatening your friends. He's changing the balance of power in the region. Your friends are suffering. You need to give more arms and commitments to us, and you need to stop the outreach to Nasser. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound like maybe if you substituted Iran for Egypt, this is exactly what the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Gulf states have been saying to us for the last 2 years about what we're doing with the Iranians? That if you do this deal, nuclear deal, and you give them sanctions relief, it's going to free up resources, that it's going to threaten us. Well, it should sound familiar to you. I mean, what are these two examples I've just given tell you? What they tell you is the priority that matters to the Arab leaders, and it has from Truman's time until today, what matters to them is their security and their survival. That's our priority. Now, who threatens their security and their survival? It's not Israel. Who threatens their survival are their regional rivals. So in the 1950s and 60s, it was Nasser. In the 70s, it was Gaddafi. Later, it was Saddam Hussein. Now it's Iran. Well, I don't know who's next, but I know it's a regional rival. And the point is that never have Arab leaders been prepared to make their relationship with the United States dependent upon our relationship with Israel. Because their priority is their security and their survival. I start off by saying we don't read correctly their priorities. I start off by saying we're not reading them correctly today, because their priority is Iran far more than it's ISIS. And unless we understand what's driving them, they're not going to be with us. Now, we don't always have to accept their priorities, but we have to understand their priorities. There's a third assumption, which I haven't mentioned yet. That third assumption that has been in every administration, and this one sometimes exists not only in the constituency that sees Israel as a problem, but also sometimes among some of those who see Israel as a partner. That third assumption is that the only way you can transform the American position in the Middle East, and the only way you can transform the region itself, is by solving the Palestinian conflict. And that has been an assumption that has been deeply embedded in the psychology. Now, the rabbi said when he introduced me, I spent a long time trying to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's true. But I never did it because I thought, gee, if we do it, that's going to solve all the problems in the Middle East. I never did it because I thought this was the root conflict of all conflicts in the Middle East. I did it because I thought it was important in its own right. I did it because it was an intractable conflict, and it's important to show you can deal with intractable conflicts. I did it because it's important for Israel. If Israel's not going to become a binational state, you have to settle this. If Israel's not going to live in an environment where it faces daily stabbings, you have to settle it, if you can. But not because if you settle it, somehow the Middle East becomes Switzerland. I mean, today, think about it. If tomorrow, since I'm in a shul, if the Moshiach arrived, I mean, if we had divine intervention and you could solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, would it stop one barrel bomb in Syria? Would it move ISIS back 1 meter? Would it change Iran's aspirations in the region? Would it end the war in Yemen? Would it put Libya back together again? Would it end the struggle that Egypt is facing with radical Islamists? The answer, obviously, is no. It isn't to say we shouldn't make an effort. It isn't to say we shouldn't see what we can do. In this part of the world, one thing we should learn is when we create these choices, well, we'll do nothing if we can't solve the whole thing, that creates a vacuum. And in this part of the world, the worst forces fill vacuums. So it makes sense to make an effort on this, an effort that is informed by what's possible, not by what's impossible. But this assumption, like the other two, once again reflects a lack of understanding of what drives Arab leaders. As I said, we don't have to we don't have to accept what drives them, but we have to understand what drives them. And our policies have to reflect that as well. Okay, so I said I titled the book Doomed to Succeed. And the question is, why did I title it Doomed to Succeed? Why did I give it a sense of irony? Well, first, because as you've seen, even from what I've said, this is a relationship that has evolved over time. It didn't start off in a strong way. We didn't even provide arms to Israel for almost its first 2 decades. We became Israel's, in Bill Clinton's words, only real friend much later on. But the relationship has evolved. It's evolved for a reason. Because we share values with Israel. We share interests with Israel. We share threats with Israel, meaning those who threaten Israel also threaten us and vice versa. And look at this region. Look at the region now. This is a region that is characterized by the worst kind of violence and turmoil. And there's a reason for it, because it's over identity and who defines it. Nothing is more basic than that. That's why these conflicts are so terrible. These conflicts are not going away in the near term. As I said at the outset, the state system itself is being threatened. But there is one state in the Middle East. There is one state in the Middle East that actually is a democracy. There's one state in the Middle East that has a separation of powers. There's one state in the Middle East that has an independent judiciary. There's one state in the Middle East that has regularly and unregularly scheduled elections, where the loser accepts the outcome. One of the best measures of democracy is losers accept the outcome. Where there's freedom of speech, where there's freedom of assembly, where there's a vibrant civil society, where there's artistic freedom, where women's rights are respected, where gay rights are respected, the only country in the region where gay rights are respected. Read the front page of the New York Times today and see what was done to one of the Hamas members of the Izzedim al-Qassam brigades because he was accused of being gay, among other things. There's only one country that has all those attributes, and that's Israel. And at a time when the region itself is characterized by enormous turmoil, there's one country that with its problems, and Israel has its problems, and they're real, but Israel's the only country that has the institutions that gives it the capacity to deal with those problems. Like most democracies, progress is rarely linear. Like most democracies, dealing with problems that are hard rarely takes place the way we would like it. But somehow, like most democracies, they figure out a way. The reason the relationship is doomed to succeed, the reason the book is entitled Doomed to Succeed, is because Israel is the one country in the region that not only is a democracy, but will be a friend to the United States at a time when the region is characterized at best by uncertainty. At a time of uncertainty, you need a pillar, you need a friend, you need a country you can count on. That's why this relationship is doomed to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Let me just make sure that everyone's aware that the book is on sale now. There's information in our office if you want to find out about it. It's also available to all of the bookseller websites, including Amazon.com. Again, the book is called Doomed to Succeed. We just have a couple of questions, and again, Ambassador Ross actually has flown in from Washington just for this talk, so we want to give him a break and a chance to get an actual night's of sleep. But we wanted to share some of the questions that have been asked, and again, I don't know how quickly you're running out of here. People can bother you a little bit afterwards. We want to just recognize how much we appreciate your time. Question number one is, can you chart a little bit how the aftermath of the Oslo Accords has impacted the relationship over the last few years?
Well, I think, look, the Oslo Accords in a lot of ways helped to produce an even stronger partnership, because the Oslo Accords were not driven by the United States, they were driven by Israel. But then we embraced it. What I say about Clinton, in Clinton's first meeting with Rabin, he says to Rabin, "You take risk for peace, and my job is to minimize the risk." When Rabin was assassinated, Clinton felt an obligation. He felt a responsibility. He felt he had failed Rabin. And so he was a deep believer in the process that Rabin had launched, and that, if anything, that's what I think created even closer ties. You know, look, the Oslo process represented both sides trying to turn what was an existential conflict into a political conflict. Unfortunately, the Oslo process hasn't succeeded. And although there's an irony, to this day, even when Abu Mazen says he's not going to, because the Israelis are not fulfilling the obligations, he's not going to fulfill the obligations, and yet he continues to do it because there's security cooperation. So, and the Israelis continue to respect zones A, B, in the West Bank, which are a product of the interim agreement. So, notwithstanding the rhetoric, notwithstanding the lack of achievement, it still provides a kind of interesting baseline.
Some presidential candidates have declared their unequivocal support for Israel in the current conflict. If one of them were to become president, how would that impact the relationship as you described?
Well, you know, I start off by saying it's a lot easier for me to explain the Middle East than it is to explain our politics right now. Look, I feel that there are people who are running who have been very clear on their commitment to Israel. Well, Clinton has been, Rubio has been, Kasich has been, Cruz has been. Trump has said that he's neutral. Trump has said that he's a friend of Israel. In fact, in the last debate, he said he's a stronger friend of Israel. I mean, the proof will obviously would be in the pudding. That's what you have to see. I mean, what are you prepared to do, and how are you prepared to do it? As I said, look, every administration, even those administrations that were close to Israel, have had differences with Israel. That's understandable. Our closest allies we have differences with. The question isn't whether you have differences, the question is how you manage the differences. And the question is whether you manage the differences or you seek to magnify the differences. I do believe one of the mistakes of the Obama administration has been to magnify differences as opposed to manage differences. But to be fair, you know, in the aftermath of the differences on Iran, and here it takes two to tango. It wasn't only Obama, it takes two to tango. You know, I don't think the appearance in the Congress by the Prime Minister was something that was necessarily the smartest thing to have done. But both sides since that time have made an effort to manage their differences. There's a discussion going on now between the two to create an MOU for the next 10 years, a Member of Understanding on security for the next 10 years. And that's being negotiated between the two sides. I really hope it's concluded this year. I'd like to lock that in. I don't know what's going to happen next year. I'd like to lock it in now. President Obama, in a letter to Gerald Nadler during the debate over Iran, promised to try to get this done. And so they are negotiating. I hope it will happen. So even when there have been differences in this administration, there's also been a sign of wanting to manage it. I do believe the next administration is likely to put more of a focus on promoting the relationship, managing differences, and not magnifying differences. And again, think about it. The reason I say that, in part, is look at the region. Look at what's going on in the region. The last thing we need when you have a region that is characterized by the scope of the conflict, by the level of violence, by the uncertainty associated with it, is to be raising issues with the one country with whom we share fundamentally common interests and a strategic convergence. By the way, think about it. Do you think when there's a gap that's opened up between us and Israel that countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt are made more confident about the U.S.? You know, what they basically think is, well, gee, if they're prepared to visit Israel, imagine what they do to us. By the way, that's also been a reality. I know, one of the interesting things I know in the Obama chapter, there's a point in 2011 where the Arab leaders are going to Israel to get the Israelis to come to us to try to make the case for us. So, in a sense, rather than all those who view that if you just distance from Israel, it helps with the Arabs, and actually the Arabs viewed Israel as a potential conduit to influence us. Exactly the opposite of what those who had a certain view of the region saw. So, look, I am hopeful that we'll see the next administration, whoever's going to lead it, that they will understand that the logic of the Middle East right now argues strongly for us to deepen the ties and any differences we have to manage them.
Just again, there's been lots of questions, and we're not able to share all of them, but I did one concluding one, which is, how do you think is the best approach from a U.S. administration to deal with the issue of incitement in the Palestinian territories?
Look, the only way to deal with incitement is to expose it. You know, the fact that there's occasional criticism of it is the equivalent of giving it a pass. We should single it out. We should identify the most egregious forms of it. We should say, this is wrong. We should be working with the Europeans and others to also collectively say this is wrong, and we should be repeating it over and over again. What is the one significant achievement the Palestinians have in their own eyes? It's having their cause seen as legitimate on the world stage. If you want to move the Palestinians in the right direction, it's tough right now because they're divided, they're weak, they're positioning themselves for succession, but the one sense of achievement that they have is that they have achieved a level of standing on the world stage, a level of understanding for their cause, support for their cause. So if you focus on the incitement and you basically get others to focus on it and say, this discredits your cause, that's the one way you can move them. But you can't move it if you ignore it. And if you ignore it, or you don't pay attention to it, or you don't give it the kind of focus it deserves, then the message is it's okay. And because you have a political culture on the Palestinian side that is shaped profoundly by a sense of grievance and wrong and injustice, it makes it easy for them to rationalize all sorts of incitement as well.
We want to thank you very, very much for joining us. And I want to remind everyone that the book is called Doomed to Succeed, and it can be found on Amazon.com and at all local booksellers. Have a wonderful night. Just before we leave, we want to just mention that we have two very wonderful events coming up. Next week at this time, 7:30 on Wednesday night, here will be Assembly Member Travis Allen. Will be the final talk in our Modern Mind series. We also have a special event added to our schedule in a week and a half on Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night here at Beth Jacob. We will be